Hey guys, Scotore here to talk about one of the most common questions I get in the game of Path of Exile, and that is, what type of gear should I be getting for my build? Should I be using armor, evasion, or energy shield? Now in this video, we're going to be talking about the most common builds that use each type of gear. However, that's not to say a melee build can't use energy shield. At the end of the day, this is Path of Exile, and one of my favorite aspects of that is how creative we can get with builds. If we figure out a great way for a melee character to use energy shield, then by all means, go for it. However, we're going to be primarily covering the most common uses, common practices, as well as the actual mechanics that each type of defensive gear provides. What is it that armor gives us? What is it that energy shield does? The mechanics behind it. And something I would like to add before we get too much into it is that if you are going to go a certain type of gear base, if you are going to choose to go evasion, then put all your eggs into one basket and dedicate all your gear toward scaling your evasion rating or energy shield or armor. You tend to want to pick one and stick to it for all of your gear. Now, if there's anything I may have missed out on that you feel is super important for newer players trying to make this informed decision as to what type of gear they should be using on their build, then please feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know of something that maybe I may have missed, or maybe someone just looking for more insight that they can get from the comment section. If you do like and enjoy this video, make sure you guys hit that like and subscribe button. Appreciate your time. Let's get right into it. In this video, we're going to be going over armor, evasion, energy shield, and hybrid based gear, as well as the mechanics for each one of these defensive layers. The first thing we're going to talk about is armor. So the first type of gear we're going to be talking about is armor. Now, builds that most commonly use armor as the type of gear choice are things like melee, necromancer. There's actually numerous different types of builds that do choose armor. It is Path of Exile after all, where you can pretty much make anything work with anything else if you're creative and crafty enough. But those are the most common ones. Those are going to be the ones we're talking about. Generally speaking, if you're selecting armor as your type of gear, you're expecting to get hit. Now, whenever you get hit by a source of damage, it's usually either physical, elemental, or chaos. Now, as Path of Exile players, we just inherently know to cap our elemental resistances, which is generally soft cap at 75. Obviously, there's ways to increase that in numerous different ways, but we're not going to get into that. So we know to cap our elemental resistance at 75, so that we can reduce that much more damage that is incoming to us, whether it's fire, lightning, or cold. Nowadays in Path of Exile, it's actually important to cap our chaos resistance as well. Same rules applies, soft cap, hard cap. And there's actually numerous enemies that deal physical damage to us, from bosses to little dudes during maps. Now, whenever we are actually mitigating physical damage, armor is probably our best avenue of approach if we're actually expecting to get hit a lot. Evasion-based characters, which is something we're going to be getting into, just tries not to get hit in the first place and essentially survive whenever it does. And an energy shield, we'll get into that later. But whenever you're choosing to be an armor-based build, you're expecting to get hit, so you're trying to mitigate as much of that damage as humanly possible. When selecting the type of gear you're going to be using for an armor-based character, you're actually able to reduce up to 90% physical damage, which is quite a bit considering how many bosses actually deal physical damage. Now, something to bear in mind, another pro toward using armor is the type of socket colors we're going to be getting from it. Generally speaking, strength-based gear drops red sockets. That's the most commonly seen socket colors. It's the most commonly rolled colors, and that does actually play an effect into it. So as you can see, the requirements on this piece of gear is strength. Anytime you see armor on gear, it's usually a strength base, unless it's a hybrid, which we're getting into later. So red colors are the most common sockets that we're going to see on these pieces of gear. And that's important during the leveling process, especially for our league starts. If we're choosing a melee type of build, we're going to be using a lot of red gems, which means the gear that's going to be dropping will be a lot more accessible to us without having to recolor it and do a bunch of extra things for it. Something to annotate whenever selecting the use of armor is we actually do take a minor movement speed hit to it. So astral plates, for example, have a minus 5%, I believe, movement speed. That's inherent. That's like a secret modifier on them that isn't displayed here. And the same goes with other pieces of gear or armor, excuse me. more so than dexterity and intelligence, which do take a minor hit as well, just not as much as armor based. Armor based gear also synergizes really well with things like endurance charges. Endurance charges provide us with 4% phys damage reduction per charge. So generally speaking, when we're actually worried about physical damage reduction and we're actually care whether or not we get hit by big bosses multiple times, that ability to continue to further push toward that 90% phys damage reduction is just a really good synergy, as well as its ability to synergize with Fortify. A lot of melee based characters tend to run Duelist or Marauder, where we have a lot of like Fortify based nodes around that area, as well as afforded to us in our ascendancies, especially Duelist having that Fortify just permanently. Whereas 20% increased, or excuse me, 20% reduced damage taken. So you're expecting to get hit and you're just trying to mitigate those big hits. So the next thing we're going to be hitting is the type of armor we could be looking at. Now, technically speaking, Glorious Plate has more base armor than an Astral Plate does. Now, this is a rare Astral Plate, so it's not really obvious here, but as you can see, 776 versus 730. The reason why you most commonly see people using Astral Plates over a Glorious Plate is the implicit 12% to all elemental resistance, which is super nice. It makes it a little bit easier to fix your res across all of your other gear by having essentially a 7th modifier that is 12% more to all of your elemental resistances. So generally speaking, you'll see other players utilizing Astral Plates over Glorious Plates. Another thing to note is we have things known as spiked gloves available to us as melee players. This is another part of the decision-making process if we're going to choose to go armor. Now, if we chose to go armor as a melee character, we have gloves that have the implicit up to 20% increased melee damage. That's like a passive node right there for us. Can we get that good of increased melee damage using either evasion or energy shield is something we can tell ourselves. Can I get something that's worthy of essentially a free passive node on the other types of gear? Will it make it worthwhile? And then generally speaking, if we are an armor based build, and let's say we're not melee and we just want the armor to increase our phys damage reduction, Goliath gauntlets are actually technically have a higher base armor rating. So if you don't really care about melee damage, maybe you're like a necromancer or something like that, you just tend to go Goliath gauntlets instead because you don't really care about the implicit there. But that is something to be a deciding factor as well. You're able to squeeze, just especially when you're min-maxing, you're trying to figure out the best way to squeeze a little bit more damage. So then we're going to go into Vanguard belts over Stygian Vises. So Stygian Vise is the most commonly used belt that we generally see across pretty much all builds. Vanguard belts do provide us up to 320 to armor and evasion, so you'll probably see this belt again in the evasion section. However, Stygian Vise, the ability to tap into an abyssal jewel, a free one, where we can get things like life, we could even get armor if we really need it, or damage, etc. That's just really hard to top. So with that being said, let's move on to our next section. The next thing we're going to discuss is evasion. Next type of gear we're going to be talking about is evasion-based gear. Builds that most commonly use evasion-based gear are bows, claws, some melee-based characters, as well as things that tend to start on the right side of the tree. Now, before we decide whether or not evasion is the right choice for us over armor or energy shield, let's talk a little bit about what it is evasion is and what it provides to us in Path of Exile. Now, we can scale our overall chance to evade attacks up to about 95%. However, it does have entropy, meaning that each time we do evade an attack, it is slowly reducing that overall percentage until we're inevitably hit. So it is incredibly important for us to continue to scale our overall effective HP to a point where we can essentially survive those big one-shot hits and then continue to reset the clock and evade those attacks. Now, something that's very important to note is that does not include spell damage. The way we are able to evade spell damage is by a separate mechanic that synergizes incredibly well with overall chance to evade, and that is a chance to dodge. This is split into two different categories. chance to dodge attacks, and chance to dodge spells. This is rolled separately and does not have entropy. We can access this type of mechanic from things like our ascendancy, phase acrobatics, essentially our skill tree, and then some pieces of gear allow us to obtain more chance to dodge. Now, is this right? Is this right for us? We got to look at our play style. If we are a speedy boy, we have a lot of access to different movement speed, etc., where we're easily able to move around an arena. That added increased ability to dodge incoming attacks or spells, etc., is something to kind of take into consider. The next thing we can look at is during the leveling process, especially if this is something like a league start or maybe we're really low on currency. Evasion-based gear is better known as dexterity gear. Synergizes really well with skill-based gems that are also green, as this gear primarily drops green sockets, meaning that we're not going to have to spend a bunch of time in town trying to recolor off-color based gear into green, because it'll naturally drop green primarily. So that's something very important to take into consideration. And then we also look at ease of access. Now, as I stated at the beginning of this section, is characters that tend to start on the right side of the tree also tend to have a lot of things such as dexterity nodes on the tree that they grab while they're pathing toward the nodes they're primarily trying to take. They also tend to path through numerous hybrid-based nodes such as evasion and life that are incredibly important to us, because that also frees up our opportunity to, instead of investing into a defensive layer that's not readily available to us, to now invest those points toward more important things such as increased damage. Something I do want to note is that if we're trying to decide on whether or not we're going to use a defensive curse, Enfeeble is probably going to be our best decision. The enemy's accuracy directly plays a role in our overall evade chance, meaning that things like Enfeeble that greatly reduce enemies' accuracy also greatly increase our overall chance to evade those attacks. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is some of the most common gear that's tend to be used by evasion-based characters. Assassin's Garb has that 3% increased movement speed as an implicit, essentially a 7th modifier, theoretically speaking, that a lot of players primarily use. However, a Zodiac Leather gives us a better increased based evasion rating, which is what I chose for my particular build. Now, gripped gloves, that's also could potentially be a deciding factor in our decision-making process, as it has a implicit between 14 to 18% increased projectile attack damage, which I look at that as a free node that I have to figure out a way to access that amount of increased damage if I were to go armor or energy shield to kind of make up for that free node essentially. And then kind of going back on the Vanguard belt, which we kind of talked a little bit about in the armor section, as it does provide us up to 320 evasion rating. However, it is incredibly difficult to, get rid of a Stygian Vise, which has an abyssal socket in it, which allows us to have more access to damage, evasion rating, accuracy, life, just a plethora of different modifiers that are easily and readily available to us. So let's go on to our next section. The last thing we're going to talk about is energy shield and hybrid gear. The last two types of gear we're going to be talking about is energy shield and hybrid gear. The reason why we're lumping these two together is because they're relatively easy to explain, and they actually do kind of synergize well with each other. Builds that most commonly use energy shield tend to be caster-based builds, and whenever we're trying to decide whether or not energy shield is the right decision for us, there are two things we can look at. The ease of access to obtain energy shield from where our build is starting and where it's at on the skill tree, because there is a heavy investment in energy shield to make it truly effective for us, as well as weighing the options of the amount of damage we're going to be able to gain from using energy shield from the different types of gear and nodes on the tree versus going like life, armor base, or evasion. Now, before we get too much into that, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics in Path of Exile regarding energy shield. Whenever you take a hit, you don't have any flasks that can just instantly recover your overall energy shield. So because of that, there is a 2-second delay period from the time you get hit and for the time the energy shield begins to recharge again. Now, this can continue to be scaled by percent faster start of energy shield recharge, which is a modifier found on, I believe, on the tree, as well as various types of gear. So an example to that would be in the way it scales. There is an equation and stuff like that, but we're not going to get too much into it. If it's a standard 2-second delay, if you have 100% increased faster start of energy shield recharge, it goes down to 1 second, similar to how scaling works, just generally speaking in Path of Exile. Something to annotate is chaos damage automatically bypasses energy shield completely unless you take a keystone known as chaos inoculation, which reduces your life total to 1. However, chaos damage does not bypass energy shield. Now, there is other like unique jewels and stuff like that that also mitigates 50% incoming chaos damage but increases fizz damage. We're not going to get too much into that, but there are some funky things out there. Now, some of the positive sides of using something like, let's say, Chevron's Wrappings, which is a unique that keeps chaos damage from bypassing energy shield. We can take nodes like Pain Attunement, which gives us more spell damage while on low life. Now, being that we don't have to reduce our life total to 1 by taking Chaos Inoculation, we just use a unique such as Chevron's Wrappings. We can then use something like Blood Magic and reserve most of our life total, and allowing us to access numerous different modifiers from the tree or ascendancies that give us more damage while we're on low life. And since we're permanently on low life from reserving our life total, this is one of those options where I was saying before about, hey, I can actually have access to even more damage if I go energy shield and reserve most of my life. Now, generally speaking, as I stated before, we don't have a flask that just recharges our energy shield. We tend to see a lot of players using things like Val Discipline, which is kind of our oh no button. We are able to push it and it instantly recovers your energy shield regardless of when you took your incoming damage, and it's an extremely rapid rate. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about hybrid gear. Generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of going hybrid gear except for very, very specific situations. Such as Sadist Garb synergizing incredibly well with Tricksters. They have certain nodes on their ascendancies tree, such as Escape Artist, which essentially say however much, or excuse me, let me get the actual reading for it. So you get +1 to maximum energy shield per 6 evasion rating. So something like, or on a body armor. So something like a Sadist Garb, which has 427 evasion rating, that's actually going to really scale our energy shield overall very nicely. At the end of the day, we are looking more at the energy shield side of it. We're not actually continuing to scale our evasion and energy shield. Ultimately, you're converting it to one over the other. Like we stated at the beginning, how the importance of just putting all your eggs into one basket. If you're going to go energy shield, go energy shield. If you're going to go armor, go armor. If you're going to go evasion, go evasion. One minor exception to that is whenever you are running energy shield, if you're not hitting your like ultimate goal of hitting 10,000 EHP, like 10,000 energy shield, we do kind of have to look at avenues toward getting things like fizz damage reduction, because we want to be able to stop multiple big hits at a time whenever we are an energy shield base character, especially if we are doing like a 1 to 2 second energy shield recharge delay. So using things like, I don't know, endurance charges or certain nodes on the tree, or even something on a chest piece that's going to give us fizz damage reduction. Albeit, if we're not a true armor base, we don't have to purposely go toward that 90% cap. But some minor mitigations to fizz damage is very much advisable, especially if you're only pushing like 5,000 to 6,000 energy shield. That's similar to having 5,000 to 6,000 life and then taking that big hit and just getting one shot. Now let's talk a little bit about the gear that's going to be available to us, and this actually kind of goes into our decision-making process when it comes to selecting energy shield as our defensive choice. Generally speaking, we see characters using Val Regalias as the most common base for chest pieces, the abundance amount of energy shield that is afforded to us. However, we do have access to things like an Occultist Vestment, which can give us up to a 10% increased spell damage implicit, which is kind of nice. I don't see this used super often, but if we are trying to squeeze just that little bit much more spell damage out, this is an option available to us. And as I stated before about the whole Sadist Garb Trickster thing, Now, this is one of the decision-making processes right here. Fingerless silk gloves. If we are a caster-based build, this implicit giving us up to 16% increased spell damage is almost a deciding factor to us. Now, if I'm going to have a build that uses spells, and if I'm like life armor, or if I'm evasion, a life, or something like that, am I going to get a node or a piece of gear or something that's going to make up for the 16% increased spell damage loss I would take from not using silk gloves? The next thing we're going to be talking about is crystal belts. Generally speaking, I do see a lot of crystal belts being used. I would say it's about 50-50 in regards to a crystal belt versus a Stygian Vise. Once again, as you've seen across the other defensive layers, Stygian Vises are just super good to have that abyssal socket to give you a little bit better or more open modifiers to select from. The next thing I do want to talk about is during the leveling process, whenever we're low on currency, as we stated before, in regards to armor and evasion, gear will tend to drop blue sockets on it. So if you are a caster based build, or a build or a skill that tends to use primarily blue gems, having access to that gear that primarily drops blue sockets is incredibly helpful for leveling characters. And as I also stated before, whenever we are a caster based build and we tend to start on the northern part of the tree, we have a lot of ease of access to energy shield nodes. Now, being that we're ultimately goal is to try and hit that like 10k mark, having ease of access from the starting point to some of these bigger nodes like Foresight, etc., are going to be a great way for us to be able to easily grab those energy shield nodes from our ascendancies, from the tree, to then invest more into damage. At the end of the day, it's about how we get more damage and survive those big boss hits. So without further ado, appreciate you guys for taking the time to watch this video. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. I'll see you guys again next time.